everyone, and welcome to the 2021 State of Medical Device Virtual Summit. This session is on software as a medical device, challenges and opportunities for 2021 and beyond. My name is Tom Risch, a senior medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speaker, Andrew Wu, and his company, Rook Quality Systems, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, this session is about 45 minutes long and includes a Q&A session at the end. Please submit your questions throughout the presentation in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. This entire session will be recorded and slides are available for you to download afterwards. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. Our mission is to improve the quality of life. Anything we can do as an organization that helps you bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. Whether it's through hosting these free training sessions or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies around the world are moving away from paper-based general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. Now on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give you a proper introduction to our presenter, Andrew Wu. Andrew Wu is a software consultant at Rook Quality Systems and is the branch manager for Rook's Taiwan branch office. His expertise and experience in medical device development and software quality assurance have proven invaluable to clients who are seeking to commercialize their software-related medical devices. Andrew holds biomedical engineering degrees from Northwestern University and Georgia Institute of Technology. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter, Andrew Wu.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the introduction. I'm Andrew Wu from Rook Quality Systems. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very humbled to have this opportunity to talk about this SaMD topic, alongside with the stellar industry panelists that the Greenlight Guru team put together. Here's my short bio. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Rook Quality Systems. We are a quality regulatory consulting firm dedicating to helping med device companies ranging from startups to Fortune 500 companies to develop and maintain QMS systems. Our team consists of experienced R&D and quality assurance engineer who have participated in device development processes in the past and are able to be hands-on with your development team, develop technical documentation alongside concurrently with the product development processes. So here are some other services that we provide. Our headquarters is based in Atlanta, Georgia, leading by Kyle Rose, our president, who also had been a very active participant in the past Greenlight Guru events. And this year we started our Asia Pacific branch in Taiwan, hoping to become the catalyst for Asia Pacific MedTech ecosystem and serve our Asia Pacific customers better. For today's webinar, I'll focus on the SaMD topic and other digital health initiatives under the current digital health paradigm and how the MedTech has been influenced underneath this COVID-19 pandemic. Also, I'd like to share our thoughts on the clinical validation challenges for our SaMD devices. Also, how you can leverage Agile Framework to develop your SaMD in sync with the QMS requirements. I will then conclude with a forecast for SaMD landscape from the quality and regulatory perspective. Okay. So it's very evident that the traditional care delivery model is being heavily challenged underneath this COVID-19 pandemic, as many people definitely are advocating the safer patient-physician interaction via a solution like telemedicine. The advantages of having digital technology being implemented, deployed into the field, in addition to safety, it's also scalable physician can communicate with more patients at once via multiple avenues, such as messaging through emails or web application, mobile application, and a lot of connected devices allow us to do that. Then the care continuum can be extended to preventive care, self-management solutions, early disease detection through digital health technology being adopted to daily use. And as I briefly mentioned, access to mobile devices and wireless technology really allow physicians to assist patient with day-to-day care. And in the next slide, I will briefly introduce a few SaMD examples which recently have been cleared by the FDA for EUA purposes. All of them are prescription used at hospital environment under COVID to improve clinical workflow and reduce workload for our frontline workers. So under this COVID circumstance, I think we can call it the down of digital medicine, right? In some perspective, the investment in digital health this year is on track to hit $12 billion, which is a 35 to 45% increase comparing to the past years, according to a report from Rock Health. So investors are really making large bets on companies in the on-demand health service space, which might include but not limited to telemedicine services, prescription delivery, and at-home urgent care. So there are a few SaMD clear for EUA use. All of them are cleared to help with having a positive effect on the clinical management workflow, helping the frontline workers to identify complications and really triaging for more efficient clinical management solutions. The other criteria for issuance of EUA for SaMD is very similar to all other devices being cleared in the market. The known potential benefit of the technology needs to outweigh the known and potential risk. And there must be no adequate approved available alternative to the technology. And it is worth mentioning that FDA put out a non-IVD EUA template for the manufacturers to leverage. So if you consider obtaining EUA for your SaMD, be sure to look up this template from the FDA website, and I'm sure you'll find it very helpful. So the three SaMD products that I'm listed here are all for early identification of patients with serious clinical complication due to COVID, such as cardiac complications, respiratory failure, or hemodynamic instability. All the software are intended for healthcare professional for use to allow faster and more accurate triaging of patients. And all software receive data inputs from available clinical environment resources like EMR, med devices, or just generic clinical workflow outputs to allow a better prediction of likelihood of complication to happen and really help out the frontline workers to reduce the workflow. I think it is very encouraging to see these SaMD tools being deployed under the pandemic and helping the worker under this difficult situation. I would highly encourage everyone to take a look at another guidance published by the FDA and have been revised by the FDA recently. It is called the Clinical Decision Support Guidance. If you are developing a SaMD under the context of clinical triaging or care delivery improvements, please consider take a look of that guidance. So on the flip side, there are some exciting updates from the policy aspect. There's a new initiative carried out under CDRH. It's called Digital Health Center of Excellence. This initiative aims to empower digital health technology companies by fostering responsible and high quality innovation that meets FDA standards. And FDA recently hosted 2 listening sessions and invited industry stakeholders to share their perspective on the regulatory challenges in the SaMD space or digital health space in general they have experienced in the past or anticipate to have in the near future. There are also new framework and update given by the FDA. One recent framework, which is a new one from the FDA, is what's the best practices of communicating cybersecurity vulnerabilities to patients and healthcare workers. And that is considered a very, very important aspect where many cybersecurity events are happening, and we're anticipating more cybersecurity vulnerability events happen in the near future because of the wider adoption of digital health technology in general. Also, FDA give updates on the pre-cert program, which is a very exciting program that a lot of SaMD device company are trying to leverage in the near future, can streamline the regulatory process. There are certain refinements on the process of excellence appraisal, review determination during the SaMD market authorization processes. Also, there's a clarification given on the real-world performance monitoring data for expanding their indications for use. So I'm sure a lot of the audiences have been tracking the progress of this pre-cert program. But if you want to learn more about it, there's a new update that FDA published on the FDA website. You will find it very informative. So it's suffice to say that FDA is really making great strides to foster innovation from the top down, and it's very encouraging to see the bidirectional communication happening between the policymaker and the stakeholders. So there are several frameworks that I'd like to highlight just briefly that can be considered as part of your software development process or software lifecycle management process in general. The TR45, which is Agile Practice standard being recognized by the FDA. We'll talk about that briefly later in the presentation. The IEC 62304 standard is definitely the cornerstone for many med device software companies to build their DHF and ensure the processes are conforming to what FDA or other regulatory bodies are looking for. There's also another set of standards published by IMDRF, which is the International Harmonized Standard Sets, giving some more deep dive into how we can demonstrate and develop conformance to 13485 conformance and what the regulatory bodies are looking for in terms of the SaMD development. And lastly, the pre-cert program is definitely something that we anticipate the FDA would allow more participants to be part of the new paradigm. Okay. So I think the message from the listening session was very clear. Much more involvement required from the stakeholders in order to foster commercialization of digital health technologies. But on the contrary, stakeholders also are hoping a clear regulatory policy for their digital health technologies. I think the benefit of that is several folds, like mitigating product risk, operation risk, clinical planning risk, or just general business risk early on, and secure the investment. I think those are what the stakeholder are looking for. FDA can give them more guidance so that they can mitigate the risk early on. So The participants for the listening session praise and advocate the international harmonized standards quite a lot in the framework from the FDA. And I think a great example, like I just briefly mentioned, is that the FDA's interaction with the IMDRF on the SaMD standard in the past and the eventual adoption of that framework. Also, the wellness versus regulated apps and the regulatory framework around AI and ML has been attracting a lot of attention in the industry as well. As the convergence of digital technology are blending with a lot of drug development or overall disease management opportunities, I think the participants also encourage the Center of Excellence to help clarify the clinical trial requirements for digital-based therapeutics and digital diagnostics. So what types of clinical trial is sufficient? What types of clinical endpoint control arms would be sufficient? How do trial design differ from other type of either traditional devices or traditional medication trials? I think the positive consequence of a more definitive regulatory pathway it can really shed a lot of insight and shed light on the planned activity and resource needed early on. So another topic being brought up and discussed extensively is how digital health tech innovation is going to enable new channels for both healthcare and wellness delivery. There are definitely many challenges that the policymaker are seeing and anticipating, but also we are very optimistic that the digital health adoption can really transform the way that we view the care delivery in general, and really can reduce the inefficiency that we're anticipating, especially being being highlighted under this COVID pandemic. For instance, the idea of a parallel regulatory review with a CMS or reimbursement review can occur, which has been brought up as an idea by the participant. That actually would enable an innovator to make investments in evidence generation that is both clinical in nature for safety and efficacy, but also the economic data can be generated as signals to the private payer market and encourage the adoption. I think those are very provocative discussion with the policymaker directly from the industry stakeholders. And again, it is very exciting to see this communication happening. So I'd like to briefly highlight this example. This product being cleared recently by the FDA under de novo. So it is a prescription-based digital therapeutic solution for patients suffering nightmare disorder due to PTSD. It is a Apple Watch app application which monitors heart rate or move abnormalities and deliver gentle vibration to disrupt their circadian sleep cycle. It has to be used in conjunction with prescribed medications. And there has been a clinical trial being carried out in the past, and that allowed them to secure the de novo clearance. And there's another multi-trial randomized chain control trial going on, enrolling 240 patients. So we really did not anticipate, this kind of digital health application being so immersed with our lives. Continuous monitoring, continuous diagnostics, and really being able to give care from the physician perspective or healthcare professional perspective, even when the patient is off the facility. I think we really did not anticipate this would happen until a lot of the connected devices are being widely adopted by the patients, and now the clinical value proposition of digital health technology is being more prominent, is being proven like by product like this. So again, we are very excited to see this movement going in the direction that we hope for. So from our past experiences with the SaMD space, we have filed a number of SaMD application to the FDA for 510(k) clearance, and also have been helping out many SaMD companies responding to the deficiencies that highlighted by the FDA reviewers. I think I'd like to take this opportunity to lay out a few clinical validation challenges for the manufacturers that we have seen in the past. So the first, manufacturer must demonstrate clinical association, meaning how much confidence the stakeholder have on the software outputs in the intended healthcare situation. The mitigation would be simple. Just talk to your stakeholder early, making sure the value proposition is being delivered, and they can, if they can, have the capacity to be engaged in independent review of your earlier product prototypes. I think that would be ideal to ensure that those output are clinically acceptable and can be integrated into the clinical workflow without any problem. So to demonstrate technical performance, many companies were wondering how much data is enough. Can you gather data from public data set, or do you need to collect data set on your own? Our suggestion is that it is very imperative to confirm with the FDA your plan early on, because those questions actually would be heavily dependent on the claims you are trying to obtain and how you plan to position your product underneath the clinical workflow. I think that's what FDA cares a lot about. The purpose and the performance of the app needs to be very clear to the end user, so they are not using it in a unforeseeable manner. Okay. Lastly, I think a lot of the boundary conditions where the software can fail or malfunction. Also, the stakeholder and manufacturer need to take a very close look to this scenario and really correct their design early on to ensure the software can reliably process the input data and generate output data. And even if those situation happens, the user should be informed in a very quick timing, and to be sure that they're not disrupting the intended use or cause any risk to the patient or to the healthcare providers. And also, depending on the maturity of the evidence or the data that you're collecting in the field, your software definition might change over time. So having a robust change control and release processes is also very critical to ensure the software lifecycle process are being followed and records are being generated. So FDA has been recognized the Agile TIR 45 standard and encourage company to really leverage the Agile framework to develop their software. I think the big part of it is just that many software are very complex, and it would be very difficult to define your requirement definitions early on and move as a water flow process. When that's done and you start developing your software and then verifying or validating your software at the end. And when there's a different feature that you want to add it in, or a feature that you need to revise based on the validation outputs, it would be very difficult and it would be very costly. So the idea of Agile is breaking down a project into different tiers. Starting from the bottom, you have a story, which is basically a small piece of the functionality digestible by by your software team, so that you can try to allocate the right resources during each sprint or scrum. So moving on, you have an increment, which is typically a 2-week sprint, where you try to complete a set of stories or tactical subtask in order to substantiate a certain functionality. And at the end of the increment, supposedly your software executable will be ready to be shipped to your end user for user acceptance testing, or just do a quick demo with your stakeholder in general. And moving up a tier, you have a release of a software, which is meaning that you might be hitting your product development milestone, such as a usability study, or a limited launch to the field. And all of these tier would be subjected to the project scope. So another area that I would like to highlight is that the risk management activity definitely needs to be carried out throughout the agile practices. I think this is the one area that the software development world have limited exposure to, like how exactly the device world is managing their risk, and what the process looks like. So for instance, the deliverables like hazard analysis, risk evaluation, risk control should be performed during each sprint iterations, and maintain a backlog requirement with associated risk is actually very important. The risk assessment definitely needs to be part of your definition of done. So whenever a new hazard have been introduced or existing hazards have been mitigated, the hazard analysis should be updated. It's just like how the device world is doing it. Also, the user story can actually be used to implement mitigation controls, and the results should be reviewed during the typical agile iteration demo or release review. And like we briefly mentioned, agile really allow the manufacturer to prioritize different features and actually allow you to reprioritize after every iterations. So having this risk-based approach in place, you are more likely to spend the right effort at the highest risk area at the much lower cost. And usability risk is another area that FDA concerned a lot recently. And Agile actually can be adapted to incorporate a lot of the human factor aspect into the development processes quite easily. So how exactly do we achieve quality at speed with Agile? We'll start with the user story and go counterclockwise. Having the rapid feedback loop on the output from stakeholder perspective for improvement is actually can be obtained very easily during Agile because of the nature of a Scrum planning. Verifying each software unit can achieve its business logic, and having a development framework like TDD, test-driven development, in place have several advantages, such as the code coverage can be ensured, the code quality implementation can be ensured, traceability will be done in a timely manner, and allow a much easier continuous integration. Acceptance testing and product demo to the stakeholder will be part of the agile processes. Version control practices, very standardized version control practices actually is very critical, especially developing med devices. A few examples just can be do regular commits, meaningful commit messages, or having draft pull request available when the code is being committed longer than a day. Add your own review comments to the pull request, draw attention to the area for reviewer where you're very unsure about, so that this reiterated process can really be beneficial, both for the software development resource standpoint, resource planning standpoint, but also from the QMS standpoint, you can really make these two processes in sync. And we have been doing a lot of that for our clients, and we're seeing very a good return on those practices. Include configuration of soup item as part of your software configuration baseline is also very critical. Your dev team needs to be skilled in this Scrum lifecycle and refactoring practices. And having the QMS perspective being introduced during the software development processes is actually something that we are seeing a lot of companies are trying to do, which definitely would be a very critical item to give the training early on to your software dev team, so that they can communicate what kind of artifact they're supposed to generate, and at what timing to satisfy the regulatory requirements. So you're not trying to repeat this whole process again from the regulatory side. Okay. I think in short, we're definitely seeing incredible growth in the SaMD space in the past year because of several obvious reasons that we have been talking about during this presentation. I think a few areas that has been very attractive to many people from the industry perspective, but also from the clinical perspective, are the preventative care, the early disease identification, and the clinical workflow streamline applications. I think those are the three areas that we would anticipate a lot of growth and many new entrants to the space. And we are hopeful that there would be more visibility on the regulatory policies from the FDA and also from the other regulatory bodies in the world to foster growth in the SaMD space. And I think we're seeing that from a lot of the engagement that FDA encouraged stakeholders to join. However, I think lastly, there are so many data breach events, vulnerability events being reported recently. So I think that might be a threat to hinder the growth in the SaMD space. But we're hopeful that the framework that FDA is putting together can encourage all the stakeholders to really look into the cybersecurity risk from a very holistic perspective. So that's conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I know that was interesting. Yeah, I come from more of a mechanical background, and design controls are pretty straightforward for that. But as we get more and more software companies, it gets confusing. So I am glad to hear that the regulatory bodies are focusing on that, and hopefully we'll have some more guidance and regulations to come. Today, so now we have some questions. We have quite a few questions. We'll get to as many as we can in this time. Just for the audience, I want you to know that Andrew will get these questions and have his contact information there. So I know he'd be happy to make some connections if needed. But Andrew, I'll just go right into the questions if that's okay with you.
That sounds great. Thanks, Tom.
All right, so we have some questions about Agile development, which I had a feeling we'd have some of those. One of the first ones we got was, the Agile frameworks typically include frequent ceremonies and artifacts. Do you know if these structure around the new, are these the structure around the new Agile FDA standard?
It is actually. So a lot of the the Agile review meeting actually has been mentioned in the TR 45 standards. But I would say the TR 45 standard is keeping the idea of ensuring the QMS and the software development practices are in sync. They're trying to make it very flexible. So a lot of time when you dive into a TR 45, you know what you need to achieve, but you don't know how exactly you do it. So I would say start with the design reviews first, right? So there are multiple checkpoints during the agile practices where it's typically being held prior to sprint or mid sprint or after sprint. So look at those review closely and see how those review can, really substantiate your design review from from your QMS perspective, and how can you leverage those information in a bi-directional way. Say, for instance, your software development team might be informing your QMS team on a new feature being added in, and the software safety classification might be changing, or the architecture might be changing slightly and causing potential rise in the risk item, for instance. So the QMS team can be well aware of any of that change, and they can inform back to the development team on how they should be prioritizing their task, and perhaps they need a little bit more information from the software development team to make a decision on the regulatory side. So hopefully that clarify a little confusion here.
Yeah, definitely. So it is obviously the quality team and the software team has to be very closely aligned. I think there's another question that's very similar to that, and you touched on some of it. It says, how is documentation done with Agile development? Does the review and testing get documented in each pull request? And then it said, are tools like Bitbucket and Jira then validated? So I guess maybe to answer that, give some best practices on like when is a good time to document around the design review probably, but how many design reviews would you is a good number? Or I know there are a lot of variables there, but any thoughts on that?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I'll keep it very high level, and I think there are so many nuances in this area. I think we're seeing much need in this area. Um, I think first, look at, from the design control standpoint, you need to have your requirement definition in place, right? Gathering your customer requirement and derive a product level or software level or different system level requirement from it. So that's very similar, work that you will be doing during sprint planning meetings, right? So you just need to ensure that your sprint planning meeting outputs like the user stories does contain adequate information, or you can standardize your user story with several fields that can basically encourage the software development team to give those information, and so that the QMS team can leverage those information to build their design control records. So after design planning, you might be conducting like design review on the UI UX design with the stakeholders, or just early prototype feasibility review in terms of the technical feasibility and all that. So you can also do a review on that, and having those information underneath your QMS actually can affect some of the product product profile or product design in a way that we mentioned briefly, just during the conversation. I really don't want to dive into like very low detail, because that might confuse a lot of people, like to what extent you need to document. But I would say,
Right.
if you have a good, task development framework, or having a very standardized version control practices, and ensure at the software unit level you're doing all the unit testing properly, you're doing automated testing, continuous integration frequently, and all that information, all that pull requests or commit hash actually can be leveraged as part of your documentation. And we're seeing so many SaMD companies are just generating that level of documentation during the audit. So whenever the auditor would like to see some other evidence that's being documented elsewhere, on GitHub or some other repositories, they can certainly, refer to that space for more clarification. But I would say, having that high-level evidence in place under QMS and ensure you are demonstrating conformance to the design control requirements is actually very critical. And I would encourage everyone to take a closer look at how do you ensure those two practices are in sync, and how do you ensure there are no redundancy activity that you're doing to really streamline this process.
Got it. Yeah, and I think we're getting quite a few questions about the design controls. There's user needs, inputs, outputs, verifications, and validations. Those were defined in the Part 820 back in the 90s. Do you have any, I know you could go forever with this question, but do you have examples of maybe one or two examples of each for software? Like what is a design output in the software world, an input and so on?
Design output can be a screenshot of your app. It can be a commit hash. It can be a pull request. It can be a piece of executable code that's being developed in a private terminal. So I would say how you orient the design control requirement in the SaMD space, it's not too far off from your software development practices, right? Your design input can be a wireframe that's putting together by the designer, and the requirement behind it might be informed by your product team, and technical feasibility might be informed by your delivery team or development team. So having that cross-functional team in place in the software development world is pretty similar to what you do in the device development space, right? You have all different cross-functional team having input to ensure you're capturing the requirements of your product properly, and to ensure the output is what everybody anticipated during the planning. So again, I think I might still have to stay a very high level here. I think to ensure the QMS requirements are in sync with your software development practices, and how do you capture those design control items. Also, the risk management item. I think the risk management aspect is actually more lacking more easily during the software development practices, because the developer have limited exposure to what the device world is doing in the risk aspect. So having those in sync and really think about how you can reduce the redundancy activity, like I said, would be critical to help you streamline the process. So hopefully that answers some of that question.
Yeah, definitely. I think the outputs, especially, sometimes I get tripped up on that. So the examples you gave there were helpful. We have a little over a minute left, and this is another question I've actually gotten a few times. Do you have any best practices on using open source software in this software as med device, obviously?
Yeah, that is definitely a very tough question. I think from the regulatory perspective, you need to ensure your open source software is being developed in some standardized manner, right? You need to ensure it's being maintained throughout its life cycle. You need to ensure whenever, say, like a cybersecurity vulnerability happens to this open software, will they inform you that happens, right? So I think that's embedded this kind of open source library to your software. Really, from the regulator's perspective, is very tough to control, right? However, you definitely need to establish a very robust like a risk assessment on embedding this type of libraries, and you need to ensure from the architecture standpoint or design standpoint, how do you mitigate, some of the potential event happens, right?
Mhm.
You definitely would anticipate, say, like an open source software malfunction or the data breach. That's a great example. How do you enhance your overall system to kind of mitigate that risk from happening, even though you're embedded a open source software, just for a much easier or much streamlined plugin that you can use in your software. So I would say, stay, really think of this question from the regulator's perspective, like what's the potential risk? How do you mitigate it? Even though you can mitigate it from the open source library level or code level, but you can certainly look at the system level and try to develop some practices or some design to prevent that from happening and really provide that evidence and justification to the regulator, would help them a lot by understand how they can view your software in that manner, the way that you want them to perceive.
Got it. All comes back to risk as always. And
Yeah.
thanks a lot, Andrew. I know it's late in your evening there. We're very grateful to have your expertise in your time. This was very informative for me. I know we've got to move on to the next one. I know there's another presentation coming up here soon. So thank you to everyone who's joined, and thank you, Andrew, again for your time.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank everyone for attending this webinar.
Yep, thank you all. Have a good day.